Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Ancient Mysteries Unearthed. I'm Brandon James Sim, interviewing our content creator and our fearless leader, Chris Noble. So tonight, we were getting on in our last episode about out of place artifacts and just a little bit of an introduction to Chris and his journeys and his adventures into the unknown, unbeknownst. And I like to say the truth because ultimately, some of these things you can interpret anything, but when we find these ancient artifacts, the fact that they're out of place means that our conception of what we should expect is different than what is actually happening. So where we left off with this was on the Piri Reis map. And just as a recap to our listeners, the Piri Reis map is an ancient map, I think from kind of the Renaissance era, right?
Yep, early 1500s.
Right. So Piri Reis actually found this map and, he pulled the information off of more ancient maps, which probably would have stemmed from the Library of Alexandria, moving into the Middle East where they didn't have such a dark age. They were actually having a bit of a golden age at the time. So there was a lot of information that's been tossed around because us humans, as much as we like to think we're different, we seem to actually work pretty well together historically to preserve our knowledge of the past, which is always a beautiful thing. And Piri Reis had this map that showed the world and the coast of the Americas going down South America and then into a landmass to the south. And the thing about the landmass to the south was you would say, what's south of South America? Well, it's Antarctica. The interesting thing about this is not only was it Antarctica, but it was Antarctica without all the ice. Not only was it Antarctica without all the ice, but if we were to use ground penetrating radar, it's actually a fairly close representation of the landmass beneath that ice. So very interesting. Of course, there's going to be skeptics who come out. They always do when they attack this kind of thing. However, the bottom line is it raises questions. And I have so many questions about Antarctica. And I'm going to just pass it over to our fearless leader here, Chris. Chris, Antarctica, why is it such a mystery? I know so little about Antarctica. When I look on the map, it's a big white blob. There's a few details, but when you really get into it, it kind of looks airbrushed. Is there more that meets the eye to Antarctica?
Yeah, definitely. Of course, Brandon, as we both know, there's so much weird stuff going on down there. And just to even complete your thought there on the Piri Reis map, there's a couple of things. One is that there were other maps found similar to Piri Reis. It's not the only one. Can't remember the name of there. I believe 2 other maps similar in the sense that they were based off of older source material. And so it's not an anomaly. There are other examples of this type of mapping that was done from your very good guess. I would say certainly from seems like the records and the archives of the Library of Alexandria, most likely, which I've heard, this is more whistleblower information, but that the Library of Alexandria didn't get all destroyed. In fact, a lot of it's in the Vatican archives now, but we'll never know because you can't get in there. So the other interesting thing to note, and this is really fascinating because this goes to show you that there was absolutely a civilization and knowledge that was before the last cataclysm of 12,500 years ago. And that is when you look at the Piri Reis map, South America connects to Antarctica. There isn't a gap. There isn't space. It connects, and it doesn't connect with ice. It connects with land. So now you have to ask the question, what point in human history, or more specifically, what point in the Earth's history did that happen? Did we have the geological evidence to show that Antarctica and South America were connected? Well, we know that it definitely happened, that they were connected, and there was way more land on this planet before 12,500 years ago. And this is another episode in and of itself, but just to quickly go over, this is a whole theory that stems, that is the kind of the core theory of the new Netflix series called Ancient Apocalypse with Graham Hancock. And that is that we once were a very sophisticated, advanced civilization here on planet Earth. 12,500 years ago, we got decimated by a series of natural cataclysms, and that rose the sea level waters to over 300 feet worldwide. worldwide. Think about all the coastal cities that we know today, all would be underwater.
New
Okay.
York, gone.
New York,
LA,
gone. LA,
gone.
San Fran, Vancouver, the list goes on and
What's
on.
the Mediterranean? What's the Mediterranean Sea look like in that situation? What does Japan look like in that situation? What does Indonesia look like in that situation?
Hawaii, Easter Island, are these the Azores? Are these places that are just tiny little dot islands? No, they're now connected to huge, huge land masses, right?
Great Lakes are
So,
probably salt water if that's the case, right? That St. Lawrence is swelling too.
I mean, the world as we know it is a completely different looking place. And that's another thing that we don't think about when we look back through history. Not that long ago, things changed and they changed really quickly. With geology, it's so common to talk about time from millions of years, millions and billions of years, and that's how things form geologically. Yes. And also, they happen quickly with cataclysm, with massive shifts. When you've got a big chunk of rock and ice smashing into the earth, or you've got solar flares, like electromagnetic slaps to the face of the earth that emit from the sun at basically close to the speed of light that comes smashing into our ionosphere and cause insane amounts of damage, huge bolts of lightning, fires, almost like laser beams coming from the cosmos, decimating anything in its sight. If these things are happening to the earth that we can't even fathom today, two things would happen. One, it destroys everything. As we know, the megafauna and most organic life on this planet, like what was it, like 70 to 75% of it were all just destroyed, and major species were extinct. Woolly mammoth, saber-toothed tiger, etc. We all know this. This is common knowledge. So when that happened, things changed, and they changed really, really quickly. So in the Piri Reis map, we've got South America connecting to Antarctica. So there's a lot of information there, but moving beyond that, what the heck is going on with Antarctica? Why is it the only place that hasn't been claimed by a nation? Why is it shrouded in so much mystery? Why can't you really actually go there and visit? You can do any kind of expeditions you want to do in the North Pole. Why can't you do that in Antarctica? It's a very mysterious continent, very mysterious landmass, and there are some really interesting historical accounts that we can go into on this episode, and also a lot, and I would say Antarctica, probably more than most topics, has a ton of whistleblower information, a lot of insiders, a lot of people that have been down there that have come out and spoken. So how much can we take this information for absolute fact? We need to be skeptical, absolutely. But when you hear a lot of similar tales coming out from a lot of different people, that's when I start to listen. So we've got some evidence like that to talk about today, and certainly some historical things that go back to World War II that we can talk about.
Okay, Chris, I know quite a bit about Antarctica, and the reason why is because this is a rabbit hole that is deep. It is a deep rabbit hole. And also, as much as we are ancient mysteries unearthed, there's a lot of modern history in Antarctica as well, with still so much mystery. It's shrouded in mystery. It's literally this white mass. And as a listener, think about yourself. What do you really know about Antarctica? What do you know? Okay, there's penguins there. Great. Who owns Antarctica? That's the big question for me. And this is a big red flag. Throughout the history of the world, we have fought over inches of land. We draw lines on a map and we fight over them. Think of what's happening right now in the world. There are land claims going on everywhere. We're always fighting and stealing land. That's human history to a T. It's a global phenomenon. The hearts of men are easily corrupted. Thank you, Tolkien, for showing us that through Lord of the Rings. But I want to know, why is it that people have claimed Greenland? I'm a Canadian citizen, so I know about the Arctic and how we have issues with the Arctic and who owns the Arctic and how do we stop people from trespassing on the Arctic. Why is it that in Antarctica in 1959, all these nations got together and said, okay, no one's going to own it. And we're just okay with that. And still to this day, there's not some rogue nation like the States or Germany or Russia or China or any of these big players who are going to say, you know what, actually, we're going to move in here and there's not a lick you can do about it. It's an entire continent. We're not talking about a small island. the natural resources alone. There's got to be gold, there's got to be silver, there's got to be oil, there's got to be natural gas, there's got to be or there's valuable things here. If I was playing a video game of the earth, of being a leading country, I'd be going to Antarctica and setting up some bases there. I would. And I just don't understand how the rest of society can say that's okay. So where do you want to start with our history of Antarctica tonight? Do you want to go into the mysteries of World War II? Because really, to me, that's kind of where it starts to get a little weird.
Let's go chronologically, like you said, and yeah, let's start with World War II. That's where we also have, in my opinion, the most amount of information that's accessible to the public, and we have the most really to sink our teeth in with this, because what happened was, after World War II, not all the Nazis, of course, were accounted for, right? And what the Allies were the most worried about was what they were doing elsewhere in the world. We know, a lot of them were harbored and hiding in Argentina. But where does Argentina in the south go? Right close to, of course, Antarctica. So it was quite logical, even on a very basic level, to assume that there could be some of the Nazis hiding out in Antarctica. Of course, there's all of these alternative theories that the Nazis were not only hiding, but have a secret base in Antarctica that they were already building throughout World War II, with some extremely advanced technology that has connections to the Foo Fighters. And for those of you who don't know, the Foo Fighters aren't just a famous band. They're named after the phenomenon witnessed in World War II when Allied and Nazi planes were witnessing other unidentified flying objects that they could not, one, understand their amazing propulsion systems that were making them do 45-degree angle turns on a dime that would kill people normally. They couldn't figure out what was going on. They weren't being fired at. There wasn't anything violent happening, but they were there, and they were clearly superior vehicles, and they couldn't figure it out. The Nazis didn't know, at least certain factions and parts of the Nazis didn't know whose they were, and neither did the Allies. So that's where the Foo Fighters came from. Well, there's theories that the Nazis had this advanced technology. They just couldn't figure out how to actually put weaponry on the anti-gravity. And that's the reason why the Allies were able to win, and I say win very loosely, World War II, and that's another discussion in and of itself. But, Operation.
Okay, Chris, I got to jump in here. Yeah. All right. So what our lovely content creator here, Chris Noble, is referring to. Okay. So I did a quick Google search, and this is just to point out the headlines. Okay. So I'm going to read out some of these headlines here for our listeners here. So I wrote in, so did evidence that Nazis went to Antarctica, and I'm seeing titles here. Nope, there was never a secret Nazi base in Antarctica. 6 conspiracy theories about Antarctica. Why Hitler sent a secret expedition to Antarctica. So obviously there's a tug of war here with these terms that we, since the pandemic, we've heard terms like, really since the Trump administration, terms like misinformation or disinformation, assuming that it's the opposite of information. What we're discussing here today would be, if you were to publicly announce this to a lecture hall or anything, as it stands, you would be ridiculed. They would pile up on you. They'd say you're an idiot. However, there's a lot of interesting facts about this. So what Chris is referring to is that the Nazi scientists after World War II, when there was a massive brain drain, and don't forget that a lot of these people were put into high institutional positions. German people in high institutional positions. These are war criminals that are now massively employed government officials, and not just by one country, by lots. So they, after the war, when asked how they developed so far in rocketry and certain technologies, they said we were helped. We know that the Germans were sending gold and reserves to South America, and obviously setting up there. And that would be a natural stepping stone if you were to be, let's say, setting up bases in Antarctica. There's spots in Antarctica called New Swabia, which are German areas. After World War II, there was a massive expedition What was that one called? Was it High Jump, or I think it was High Jump, right?
Yeah,
Project High Jump.
so Admiral Byrd was he was the head behind Operation High Jump, and that was the largest naval expedition ever launched by the U.S. Navy at that time. So it wasn't just a small, let's go see what's going on in Antarctica for scientific research based reasons. This was a full blown naval expedition, and when I say expedition, that is what they were referring it to because they were trying to keep it very hush hush. But really, what kind of expedition scientifically has battle cruisers and aircraft carriers and basically like full blown warfare naval operations going down to Antarctica, and that's exactly what happened. This is not conspiracy. This is definitely, absolutely in the history books, and you can look this up for yourself. And I definitely encourage you to do this. And so that's really where that came from, that beginning. And what the other treaty or the other operation, excuse me, that Brandon was referring to is Operation Paperclip, which is what happened after World War II, where the U.S. and then the Russians and a couple of other countries, but mostly Russia and the U.S. gobbled up all of the top Nazi scientists, including Werner von Braun, who was the head of NASA. Let's not forget, like most of NASA, most of what brought America to the moon was Nazi technology, and that's not a crazy conspiracy theory or a claim. It's a pure fact. If you think about the head of NASA and many of the engineers and other major high up people in the rankings of NASA were all German. They were all scientists that were taken during this Operation Paperclip right after World War II. So this is absolute fact. You can look all this up. And so it's really interesting when we start with this story of Admiral Byrd and his legion of ships that went to Antarctica. Interesting things happened, and the accounts of Admiral Byrd himself, specifically his journal entries, are really, really fascinating. But before we even get into that, what really seemed to happen is that they got back a lot earlier than they expected. They came back prematurely, and they kind of came back with their tail between their legs. And only a couple of public accounts could see why. There was one time where Admiral Byrd went public, and then he was silenced immediately. And he said that they were met by hostile forces that had extremely advanced technology. And that's kind of all he got into. And then he was silenced. But if you read his journals, there's a lot more information. I'm sure, Brandon, you know a lot about that, right?
Yeah, I believe his quote was they had the ability to go from like pole to pole. So basically what he's describing is, it sounds like flying saucers. Is kind of the way that most people interpret that. And once again, to our listeners, this is the problem that we run into, is that when we say we uncover more questions than answers, now all of a sudden, when you just want to look into the history of Antarctica, you start to peel back these fantastical layers that sound like a Hollywood screenplay.
Where do they get those screenplays from? You might want to start asking,
well,
right?
Maybe from Chris Noble's Ancient Mysteries Unearthed channel. I don't know. But it's, I mean, the term crazy and preposterous and conspiracy theory start getting thrown around. However, the term conspiracy theory, if you actually look at the history of it, was I think the CIA used it to kind of discredit people who were digging into their affairs. So if you really think about it, what legion of conspirators are like, yes, we will make up a story about aliens in Antarctica. Yes. There's no conspiracy. That conspiracy suggests a collusion of thought. And really what we're doing here is we're just following the breadcrumbs. Project High Jump was played off as a scientific documentary, and they filmed, whether it was down there or whether it was done maybe in the north or something. There is a documentary that's like that classic American, like, look, folks, here we are down in, led by Admiral Byrd in Antarctica. And they have that whole spiel, and it's like this glory of America kind of vibe, as was, fashionable at the time. But Admiral Byrd himself, is now deemed, he's wrapped up in, if you look into Admiral Byrd through an unfiltered lens, you're going to hear stories of him flying into the earth through openings, which, whatever you believe, the hollow earth is one of those things that gets talked about by ancients, in the ancients, in India, and certainly a lot of the Buddhist cultures, Hindu cultures, they reference it.
Shambhala, Agartha.
You got it. Even look at, when I look at a globe, a true globe, like a physical globe, there's a hole that goes through the poles. They literally put a hole in the globe. So I often wonder if we don't already know these things, but yeah, Admiral Byrd talked about a threat there. First of all, he said that Antarctica is of great importance to the glory of his nation, that there are temperate zones there. There are oases, I'm not sure what the right term is, warmer zones in there.
Volcanic. There's a lot of geothermal and volcanic activity. There's some major volcanoes under the ice, but they create these little hotspot oases like you're talking about.
Well, there's lakes that have been, ice locked from the world for millions of years, or millions of years is for this X amount of time, where its own evolution has gone on because it's been a microclimate. There's a lot to unpack in Antarctica, and you cannot, spoiler alert for our listeners, you cannot get into it without getting into the modern UFO discussion.
There's just so much, right? And the Admiral Byrd, journals that I was mentioning before. I mean, all he does is talk about these extraordinary experiences where he's literally invited in to these craft, and instead of finding necessarily just this Nazi presence, he found so much more. It seemed like it was far more complex than just the Nazis. There were other beings, perhaps other factions from other nations that were clandestine, that were a part of this. Very, very complex. And he did talk about going on a ride in these flying saucers from pole to pole in about 10 minutes. It took them to go pole to pole at incredible speeds. And it felt so smooth because they had figured out this idea of anti-gravity. And then to go into these cavities in the earth and experience a whole completely new ecosystem, seeing beings that he had never seen before, and seeing plant life and fruits and vegetables that grew to be like 5-6 times the size of what we would expect here on the surface of Earth, and so many more unimaginable stories. And then, of course, the aftermath of him having these experiences and trying his best to, he's still military, so he's still trying to keep things secret, but then understanding the importance of this information and trying to get it out to the public as well, of course, led to his demise. And you can look that up too, but it looks pretty clear that he was taken out, as they say. So yeah, there's a lot to unpack with his story, and what all it does is ask, though, it brings up so many more questions about what in the hell is going on in Antarctica? What's going on under the ice? You hear rumors that they found also a pyramid in Antarctica. And these are, again, rumors, a couple of photos floating around that have been, supposedly debunked, but who really knows? And so you got to wonder, too, of these stories where they say, and I've heard this from many different whistleblowers, that they found an underground civilization under the ice. Is that so crazy to think about? Especially when we see the Piri Reis map and we see that they knew what Antarctica looked like before the ice. Therefore, there must have been people. Like, why would they leave that landmass unlived on? Of course, they would be inhabiting it. And then it got frozen over, almost potentially really, really quickly. How would that have happened? Well, maybe at the beginning of the last ice age, there was also another cataclysm that led to a quick freezing. And then you could have very much in theory had a civilization there that just got frozen over quickly due to external forces, cataclysms, etc. So there's a lot of really interesting questions down there.
Kind of like an Arctic Pompeii situation.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, a lot of people, do say that if there is a civilization in Antarctica encased in ice, that, some people obviously we always want to discover Atlantis, right? So people are saying maybe it didn't sink, maybe it was frozen, which, if you are in an avalanche and you suffocate in an avalanche, they do say you drown because that is a form of water. Interestingly enough, I always wonder, so in Antarctica, there's two classes of thought. Well, I guess three. The mainstream would just tell you that it's a barren chunk of ice, that no one's ever been there. They discovered it in the great age of exploration. I think is it Captain Cook who was down there? There's one of the great explorers found it. It was discovered by a European, and that's when things were discovered. Yes. But we see that evidence of the Piri Reis. We see the evidence of the ancients. So the question being, you hear about perhaps it's a crash site. There was aliens there who existed. And the crazy thing about that, from what I've heard, is that the aliens that existed there almost had the body shape and size of the Colossus sculptures in Egypt. So that's a crazy thing on its own that maybe we can touch on a bit later. But at the end of the day, if it's not this crazy alien vein that wants to take over, that seems to be this predominant thought process with down there, isn't it possible that the great pyramid builders of the world, our great ancient ancestors, isn't it possible that there was something there?
Yep, absolutely. Of course. And this is really one of the main purposes of Ancient Mysteries Unearthed, is to take the unearthed part of that name and really literally figuratively dig into it. Because this is where, when you're mentioning that, we do have these new technologies to measure. We got LiDAR, we got more sophisticated ground penetrating radar. I personally believe that it's going to come down to independent researchers that want to find out some of the answers to these questions and go down to these places and start our own process of digging. Now, to go to Antarctica and do this, I know you're going to run into a lot of red tape. And I've heard this from other people that you can go on little cruises and stuff down in Antarctica, but you just get the tip of the landmass and then you're out again.
But I thought no one owned it. So why would you, it's so kind of a hard, conflicting view, isn't it?
It's really weird, because for those that would want to research, you have to go through, and it's worse than trying to do research in Egypt. And I know that's from experience as well. That's a heck of a lot of red tape there, and it's way, way worse in Antarctica. Why would a big chunk of ice be so strict for people, like are almost forbidden to go down there? It's so weird when you think, oh, there's nothing to see here, don't worry about it, yet don't ever come here. Like, for someone like me, I'm like, well, okay, first of all, if you had nothing to hide, why would you have to forbid people from going to, see it? Second of all, how could you make it sound more enticing? Yeah, like, you know what I mean? Like, it's like telling me, oh, I have a secret, but I'm not going to tell you. And you're like, well, now I want to know, like, what's going on down there, right? Especially with climate change. Now too, we've got so much of this ice melting that all the things that we're talking about today are going to come to light, whether the forces that be that are down there that are trying to keep it secret and hush hush, it's going to come up because literally the ice is melting and it's exposing these things. And so we're going to have to see it eventually. And I really believe, and one of the things I want to be doing with Ancient Mysteries Unearthed down the road, hopefully not too far down the road, is actually launching self-funded, privately funded expeditions around the world to try to find some of the answers to these questions. Because I personally don't really think that the major institutions are going to do this themselves, because they have too much politics. There's too much politics, too much power and control involved in these things, and things take forever for them to get done. I think it's going to come down to the independent researchers like you and me and those of you listening. So that's one of the best ways that we can discover that what the truth is in places like Antarctica.
Well, I don't know how much of a researcher I am. I'm just interviewing our researcher here tonight, but I certainly am. I have a thirst for the truth, much like all of us here listening. And at the end of the day, I love a good story. And the story of there's nothing there, don't worry about it, no one's fighting over it, nothing's there, look the other way. Unless I can go there myself, it will always be a mystery, because otherwise I'm relying on satellite imagery that's obviously easily manipulated, because who is controlling that? And then I have the official statements. So other than whispers and secrets, I have to rely on things like Ancient Mysteries Unearthed, this channel, to find discussions that provoke my curiosity. And for those of you who don't know, we have a membership program here at Ancient Mysteries Unearthed. For 33 cents a day, you can become a member and get access to a full community support, access to insider information, access to things like upcoming trips, upcoming live blogs, anything you can think of, more information, less suppression, and it's just fun because for some reason our curiosity is deemed dangerous.
Yeah, exactly.
Threatening, dangerous, and truly most people that I know are good people, and we just have questions and we have a childlike curiosity, and I think that's such a humbling thing. So come join our community. We're going to post some links below here, just referring to some of the information that we've seen before. Channels like Gaia, other subscription services are great information for hearing stories. Of course, it's hard to find anecdotal. It mainly is anecdotal in a lot of ways. There's lots of hard ways to find, those primary documents without proper research and excavation going on. But
we've got them. We've got them, and like you were saying, Brandon, like there's some stuff like this episode today on Antarctica. We're going really truly to the breadcrumbs. There's not as much information, but it's still fascinating what we do know and what we do have to work with. But there's a lot of other things that we'll talk about in future episodes where there is overwhelming evidence, and there's so much physical, written, and many other forms of evidence that we can go into about a lot of different sites, cultures, and many more anomalies and mysteries. And just before we end off this episode today, I wanted to read a quick quote from Admiral Richard E. Byrd that we were just talking about today in our episode. And I think it's pretty poignant with what we've been talking about. So he's quoted in his diary of saying, "There comes a time when the rationality of men must fade into insignificance, and one must accept the inevitability of the truth. I am not at liberty to disclose the following documentation at this writing. Perhaps it shall never see the light of public scrutiny, but I must do duty and record here for all to read one day. In a world of greed and exploitation of mankind, can no longer suppress that which is truth." So thank you, Richard E. Byrd, Admiral Richard E. Byrd, for that. And for anyone that's listening, please look up his story. There are so many amazing, if you look into his journal entries, he talks about the inner earth cultures and civilizations, different beings that he talked to, and beings that contacted him after his journey to Antarctica. And then the incredible military suppression that he experienced after that as well. And the disillusionment of his, what he thought was right and what's wrong. So great story to follow up on. Thank you so much, Brandon, for the interview today. And for all of those of you listening, thanks for tuning in. And I really appreciate it. And closing words from our lovely host here, Brandon James Sim.
Well, thanks for listening, everyone. Chris, thank you so much for the discussion. It's been so much fun. I can't wait to get into another one. I'm sure our listeners can't either. I know you've spent an extensive time researching Egypt. You've been to Egypt. You've done the whole thing. You've stuck your head in tombs and structures that I will never, ever see in my lifetime. I just, you have the knowledge. You've been there. You've seen it with your own eyes. I would love to dig in as we talk about Antarctica, because Antarctica is owned globally. I would love to dig into this global phenomenon of structures and history. And as you were talking about with rivers and oceans being passageways before, I would love to talk about maybe the influence of the ancients and how far it truly went. So I'm going to tee that up for our next episode for our viewers there. And just say, stay kind, be curious to all of our listeners. And thank you, Chris, for having us in today. It's been such a pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Brandon.
All right, everyone. Links below. Stay curious, and we'll check up with you next time talking about global phenomenon of the ancient structures around the world.